Hi there, welcome to Boxing Deep Dive. I'm Lyndon Hosking and great to have you along for another episode of Dream Fights. This is where we match up two fighters from different eras and we break it all down and give our opinion on who we think wins and why. I'm going to bring in my co-host for this episode. We have Grant Tassie Brown and Mike Altamura. How are we, guys?
Good, thanks, Lyndon.
Yeah, great.
This is a great one, guys. I'm really looking forward to this one. This is yours, Mike, wasn't it? I think.
Yeah, I just think it's a fight I think that all of us in Australia have pondered at one point or another, and
definitely
stylistically, it's a guaranteed bum burner. Absolute guaranteed bum burner.
Yeah, exactly. And this is obviously one for the Aussie fans. Before we actually get to that, guys, it seems like a lifetime ago because we missed last week, of course. But before that, we had the real deal, Evander Holyfield up against Joe Fraser. Now, I think from memory, Mike, you and I both went for Holyfield.
Holyfield, yep.
And Tassie went for Joe Fraser. So what do we know? The poll, the Instagram poll, this is how it turned out. 75% for Joe Fraser, 25% for Evander Holyfield. So, Mike, I think it's time for us to officially throw in the towel. What do you
How
reckon?
many Instagram accounts does Tassie Brown have?
Oh, Mike, come on, Mike.
And I think nearly all of the votes, bar a couple, were by knockout too. That Fraser by knockout. So there you go.
Well, that's because they're remembering the wrong version of Holyfield.
Yeah, I just watched the highlights of when Holyfield beat Foreman and these types.
It's a 50-50 fight, boys. 50-50 fight.
Yeah, 75%. Come on, guys out there and girls. Pick up your game, 75%. It wasn't that one, so especially by knockout.
Smoking Joe. Smoking Joe.
All right, on to this week's fight. As I said, it's an all Aussie affair. Mike, who have we got?
We've got Danny Green Machine Green against the Hitman Jeff Harding. Light heavyweight world title, of course, both former WBC, right? WBC light. No, wait.
Yeah, we'll
Danny
call it
WBC or
WBC,
WBA?
yeah.
WBC, right?
And I think Danny had the WBA.
WBC interim at 168, WBA at
Yeah,
175.
Danny
That's
had
right.
the
But
WBC.
both,
WBC.
Yeah. I think.
both former world champions.
Yeah.
All action fighters. Like I said, stylistically, it's a great clash. West Australia versus New South Wales. I think both guys, and I think both you gentlemen will agree with me. Both guys were better boxers than people thought. They weren't just brawn. They weren't just reckless, aggressive punches. Both of them had a little bit of skill behind the power punching, and both of them similar backgrounds. I mean, Danny Green, from memory, 43 amateur fights, 2000 Olympian. Harding had under 30 amateur fights, Commonwealth Games, turned pro in the mid-80s, and immediately stepped up. His second fight, he fought Emmanuel Oddie, who was a former, actually at that point, a future world title challenger at super middleweight. So both of them kind of took significant steps early in their career and made the most of both the amateur and professional journeys.
They were very similar fighters, weren't they, Tassie? They were both, I won't say, like Mike's right, they were better boxers than what they were given credit for, but neither one of them, I think, let's just say neither one of them was Roy Jones Jr. as far as the skill goes, but both of them, they'd underrated. They both had really solid jabs. They could both punch. They both had iron jaws. So they're very, very similar type of fighters.
They both had good fundamentals. They both had very good left jabs. They both went to the body well. They both had a good kit of punches. Both good, like Mike said, good amateur careers. Green with the Olympics. I think Harding won a silver at the Commonwealth Games, if I'm not mistaken. New Zealand.
Was it a silver? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But look, so both very similar. Jeff Harder was trained under Johnny Lewis originally, and Danny Green was trained under Jeff Fennick. So, I mean, very similar teachings. Both tough guys. Yeah, look, very, very evenly matched. Like two really good, great Australians. They weren't flashy, but they both got it done when it mattered, and both trained very, very hard, So, yeah.
Well, let's have a look at the record of Jeff Harding, Mike. 23-2, 17 KOs, which is surprising. I actually thought he had more fights than that, but only the 25 fights. Two-time WBC light heavyweight champion. You can see his biggest fights there, the 12th round knockout of Dennis Andrews in 1989. Who can forget that one? Defended against Tom Collins, Nestor Giovannini, and then was stopped by Dennis Andrews. I was actually at that fight the year after. Regained it in a third fight against Andrews. And you can see there, Christopher Tiozzo, David Vedder, and ended up losing to Mike McCallum in 1994. But Mike, are you with me? I actually thought he had more fights than that, but because he won the title obviously in his 14th fight, I think. So obviously he only had another 11 fights after that.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at his resume, though, like I said, he was fast-tracked. He was a 10-round fighter from his second contest. He didn't have any 4 or 6-round development. By the time, the Andrews fight was against the grain, but by the time he had taken that fight, he had beaten Nestor Giovanni, who was a future world champion, had beaten him leading in, had beat Doug Sam, had beat Apollo Sweet, who was a future Commonwealth Cruiserweight champion, had beaten... like I said, Doug Sam, who was a world title challenger, Manuotti world title challenger. Yeah, he beat, in his first 14 fights, I'm not saying that he beat top 5 guys in the world, but he beat very, very solid fighters. So his record's kind of deceiving in that he had 25 fights, but he really didn't waste any years. It was, every fight was significant in moving him forward, and once he got to the championship level, he remained there.
He was an honest fighter, wasn't he, Tassie? He was probably the epitome of just an honest fighter. He just stood in front of you. He wasn't scared to box with you or punch with you or whatever you wanted to do. He was just there. And I think, obviously, Dennis Andrews learned that the hard way in 1989. And speaking of that fight, how could we ever forget that? We talk about the Jeff Horn over Pacquiao and Kambosos over Lopez, and I know there's numerous other fights there, but that fight with Andrews has got to go down in Aussie folklore, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's up there, one of the biggest Aussie victories of all time, and what he went through to get there. Like Mike said, he was fast-tracked. Most Johnny Lewis fighters are. A lot of Johnny Lewis fighters. Justin Russell, his debut was a 10-rounder. So, I mean, he brought you along quite quickly. Look, mate, as I said, I think he beat Vedder twice. Mike Wildoff, some great wins. To beat Christian Tiozzo in France, amazing victory. And even the loss to the great Mike McCallum, that was, that was no disrespect there. But the thing with Hardy, I heard he was inactivity. For that time, in between those fights later on, he was very inactive, managerial troubles. When he left Johnny Lewis early on and went to Manny Hinton. But inactivity really killed Hardy. He should have been champ for a lot longer. And being inactive and then fighting Mike McCallum was a bad mistake. But look, he's a great fighter, non-stop, tough as anything. And I was lucky enough to see him up Newtown right at the end. Every now and then I'd bump into him, but great fighter.
Mike, do you think that leaving Johnny Lewis back in the day hurt him or actually helped him when he went to Manny Hinton? It was obviously Johnny Lewis's offsider at the time.
It's hard to tell. He had a significant run. I'm not sure if Lewis was training him, if he would have been able to continue landing those opportunities in Europe, which he did. He kind of was out of sight, out of mind in Australia, but he was earning great money fighting in France, like Tassie alluded to, the Tiozzo fight, beating Tiozzo on his own turf. But I do think that what he lost when he made those steps away from Johnny Lewis was he lost that support that you might have with someone promoting you in Australia, where you not necessarily you get a bit of home cooking, but the deck is stacked in your favour. Whereas when he dropped the title to McCallum, everything was against him. McCallum had a tune-up. Jeff had been sitting on the sidelines and then was kind of rushed into the bout without being able to call the shots because he didn't have the right support systems around him. So it's hard to tell. I mean, end of the day, he opted to make that decision. I believe he felt he wasn't getting the attention that he wanted as a fighter, and it is what it is. Who knows how history would have been had he remained there. But this night right here, first bout with Dennis Andrews, that's, a bonding moment that him and Johnny Lewis are forever connected to.
Exactly. And I think you probably can't blame him in hindsight, Tassie, because at the time, Costa was there. Obviously, Jeff Fennick was there. Every fighter worth his salt wanted to go and train at Newtown under Johnny Lewis. So you could probably understand that he didn't want to just be another fighter in the stable. He was obviously behind Jeff and Costa as well. So you could probably not blame him for trying to go out on his own.
Yeah, look, I mean, Newtown was a stacked gym. I'm not sure, because just a little bit before I got there, but I mean, what went on, but I mean, he obviously had a relationship with Manny Hinton as well, and he would have obviously gave him a lot one-on-one attention, but I believe it was a mistake to leave Johnny Lewis, like Mike said. With Johnny Lewis, there was Bill Morty, there was a lot of Johnny's well known and loved in Australia. I mean, then he had to go overseas on the road, and that can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. But I mean, whatever it was, later in the career, the inactivity killed him. He should never have fought McCallum when he did. He should never have retired when he did, because he was still a good fighter. But the inactivity it kills fighters. You know what I mean? And he just needed to fight more regularly, and we didn't. And then he just went off into the sunset. I mean, we didn't get to see. We needed to see more Jeff Harding. We deserved to see more Jeff Harding. He deserved to do more. A bit of a sad ending to just sort of, after McCallum, that's it. Yeah.
Mike, you've got to give Jeff a lot of credit as well, that after he got knocked out by Dennis Andrews, it was a pretty brutal knockout in the end, that he actually regrouped and not only beat Andrews for a third time in England, to then go on to those other fights as well, and obviously the loss to McCallum in the end. But you've got to take your hat off to him for being able to recover and get his career back on track.
It's the mentality of a champion. And even the way that the adjustments he made in the third fight with Andrews, where he relied more on his jab, he was combination punching. And like when I said earlier, I mean, you see here, he's taken a few shots off Giovanni, but what I always found underrated in Jeff's style was he punched very short, very, very compact. You see, he'll throw 2-3 punches and doesn't wind up his shots. Very sharp, very precise puncher, and then bang, you bring a hook out of left field or a right hand and stun his opponents. And I think that his jab was it wasn't a real hard jab like Danny Green's, but it was just a pesky jab that constantly would get in your face and throw you off rhythm, so that you're right there to be hit with a left hook like that.
Left hook to the head, left hook to the body was one of his favourite punches, I think, if you watch those highlights. Well, that's Jeff Harding. Let's get on to his opponent, the Green Machine, Danny Green, 36-5. 28 KOs, a WBA light heavyweight champion 2007. I didn't put the interim titles in there. I didn't put the IBO titles in there. I think this is his legitimate world title that he won, even though the fight against Eric Lucas was a great win. It was an interim title. So you can see there, he lost to Marcus Bayer in 2003 in that highly controversial fight in Germany. As I said, the Eric Lucas fight, he rebounded, lost a 12-round decision to Marcus Bayer, and then Anthony Mundine in one of the biggest Australian fights of all time. Won the WBA light heavyweight title with the 12-round decision over Stipe Drews. Who can forget the knockout of Roy Jones Jr. in 2009. Had those two really bad knockouts in 2011, and then had the win to finish off his career against Anthony Mundine in 2017. So Tazzy, what are your first thoughts on the Green Machine?
Mate, I had the opportunity to train alongside Danny. Both turned pro under Team Fennick at the same time, and first hand, mate, seeing how hard he worked. We both were ready for our debuts. I think we had our debut 2 weeks apart. Mate, one of the hardest workers. I mean, Danny Green would go off and really work his ass off to perfect anything he was taught. Really, really, you're talking like a Jeff Fennick style work ethic, a George Gambosis. Really, really hard worker in the gym, mate. It really, I mean, we all train hard in the gym, but Danny was one of those. He dot every I and cross every T, mate. He was a very hard worker, mate. He started off, knocking them all out. I mean, he was. I remember because I was around the same time. I mean, he was fighting on Fox a lot. He had some good wins early. one of his biggest tests early was Paul Smallman, who was a pretty good, Aussie puncher, and he got rid of him and Joel Burke and guys like that, Bradley Mayo. Then Jason Delisle, who they fought as an amateur. Jason actually got a win over Danny Green in the amateurs. Win over him early on and was really just coming along nicely, mate. He had a great left jab, very hard right hand, good to the body, a good left jab to the body, which he'd really stab your chest. And then obviously the fight with Bayer went over there and almost, he was like a novice and almost knocked out the German WC World Champion. And, the head clashes and the headbutts and all come into it. But I mean, if he was pulled back a little bit, he walks away with the WC title there and then. I mean, Danny Green, look, as I said, very, very hard worker, mate. Yeah. Very hard worker.
Yeah, and Mike, I think one thing that that Danny had that Jeff probably didn't have was that great personality. He was, where Jeff pretty much shied away from it, or whether it was intentionally or not, Danny had that charisma and the aura about him that just endeared himself so much to the Australian public, didn't he?
Jeff was an introvert. Jeff wanted to be world champion, but I think he struggled with the concept of fame, whereas Danny Green understood that fame and attention was part of the process to building his name. Hence why he's the Green Machine. He made a lot of money in his career by knowing how to present and how to sell himself and then backing it up in the ring with action, because words without action mean nothing. And I think that Danny Green's a great archetype in Australian boxing history of fighters that understood every process of the business and maximised their earnings because of it. He's a charismatic guy. To me, Danny's always been a very exciting fighter, fun to watch, hell of a puncher, can end the fight at any moment. But like I said, with Jeff as well, Danny was more skillful than people think. Tazzy alluded to it, the jab to the body, jab to the head. Danny had a real vicious, he had a real vicious left hook where he would throw a right hand. So if Danny would throw a jab right hand, you had to watch that the hook was coming back. Or if he let off with the hook, you had to watch your right hand was coming back. And he could throw it seamlessly. He wasn't just throwing punches recklessly hoping to land. There was an artistry there, how he marauded and stalked and broke down guys.
Yeah, well, I remember another little story here. I mean, when he first turned pro, I think he'd only had 6 or 7 fights. And I remembered some of my friends who knew I went to the Commonwealth Games with Danny in '98, where he broke his hand and was out after the first fight. But non-fight fans who said, "Have you heard about this Danny Green?" And it amazed me because he only had 6 or 7 fights at the time, but that was the appeal. And Tassie, he really played on that, didn't he? Even to the song that he came out to, which was Down Under, and it was the classic Aussie larrikin, and he really got himself out there. And this is probably in the days before the social media aspect as well. So who knows how big he might have been in this day and age.
Funny story, mate. Danny Green's debut in Bankstown on the Nadal Hussain undercard, Victor Chinian, Danny and Sakio Pickles on the card, and I was scheduled to be on that card, but they moved me back. I fought 2 weeks before my debut. I actually got his song downloaded, Land Down Under, off a mate of mine onto a disc, and that was his come out song for his debut. So I actually got him his debut song, which he knew what he wanted, but he needed to download it onto a disc, and I got it done for him. So, look, I was right there for Danny's early fights because I was part of Team Fennec, and I'd seen how it all went on, mate. And he moved very fast. Fox Sports, Fennec Fight Nights, and knocking guys out, and mate, very charismatic, and he was a breath of fresh air, I think, at the time for Australian boxing.
Yeah, and like Jeff Harding, Mike, started with a very well-known trainer, obviously, in Jeff Fennick, and did the same thing and actually parted ways. I know it's probably, Taz, you might even know a little bit of the story about what happened as well. Jeff sort of said the story a couple of times, but similar thing, isn't it? He left Jeff, who had a lot of fighters at the time, and went out on his own again with Angelo Hyder, of course, and and obviously it probably paid off for him more than what it did for Jeff Harding.
Well, he had a much longer career than Harding. I think that's the difference. Harding never boxed post-prime, whereas Danny made a lot of money post-prime.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, that's the Green Machine, Danny Green, and the Hitman, Jeff Harding. It's that time of the show. Tassie, we're going to start with you. Jeff Hitman Harding, Danny Green Machine, the Green. Who wins and why?
Mate, great fight. I believe it's a battle of the jabs, but I think Danny Green starts a bit faster. Starts landing that big jabbing to the body, and sort of really stuns Harding early and even drops Harding early, like in round 2, round 3. Then they both sort of have their moments during the fight, and then Hardy sort of starts coming on, closing the distance. You know, the shots that Green was hurting Hardy's not really hurting him now. He's going to the body. He's starting to wear Danny down, and we've seen Danny get tired a lot in fights. I mean, what happened when he got burnt out against Sullivan? I mean, you know, that was still affecting him later on. Even the fights of Mundine, I think he sort of, as the fight went on, it wasn't as good. So I believe, yeah, it's a real steady pace fight. I think Harding gets a knockdown later on as well, gets a bit of payback. It goes the distance, and I believe Harding closes the gap and finishes stronger in an absolute thriller. Probably goes down as one of the greatest fights in Australian history, and Harding wins a split decision.
Okay, Mike, I'm going to go next because this is your fight,
Sure.
so you can bring us home, if you will. Yeah, look, I agree with you, Tassie. I think it would be probably one of the most brutal fights in Australian boxing history. I think they would, literally punch the shit out of each other. Look, I think Danny Green would start very fast. Jeff was a little bit of a slow starter. I think I like Danny Green in the early rounds because Danny Green was actually quite fast. If you look at the highlights we just saw, he's actually a lot quicker than Jeff Harding. Jeff Harding just sort of wound you down. I think Mike said use the jab more as a range finder rather than a damaging weapon to set himself up for those uppercuts and hooks and body shots in close. So I think Danny Green wins a lot of the early rounds. Like you, Tassie, I think Jeff Harding does start to find his rhythm and his range and pick up the pace and maybe finishes over the top of Danny. But I just think Danny punches hard enough. He's fast enough. He's got enough in the tank to get the win, and I think he beats Jeff Harding in a close decision. I won't say split decision, but I'd say unanimous. But maybe 7 rounds to 5. I think it'd be a ripper fight. I think both of them would be busted up. They were both great punches. Both very resilient. But I just think, as I said, the speed of Danny Green would be the difference, and I think he does enough to get a unanimous 12-round decision over Jeff Harding in, as I said, one of the most brutal and entertaining Aussie fights of all time. So, Mike, it's up to you. It's 1-1. Who have you got?
Well, I think you guys pretty much have said everything of how I see it playing out. I think that it'll definitely be a brutal fight. I'd imagine that whatever the cutmen get paid in both corners, they're getting grossly underpaid. So I think they're going to play a significant role. I see there's attributes each guy has. I think Danny was probably maybe a bit harder a puncher early in fights. Like you said, Harding would gradually work his way in. Danny was faster. I think Harding had a better defensive shape in that he was consistent even as he tired. Mm-hmm. The only thing that I can separate him on, which plays into my rationale on the fight, is I can't think of a light heavyweight the last 50 years that was better conditioned than Jeff Harding. And I just think that late in the fight, he might be able to just forge forward enough where, like a 7-round to 5 kind of deal, he's able to bridge the gap and then not run over the top of Danny, but be able to edge Danny in the later rounds. But it's a flip of the coin. I could have a different answer. I could watch highlights of both guys and have a different answer next week. But on this particular day, I just lean to Jeff Harding. But, that's not to discredit Green, who goes down as one of Australia's greatest fighters ever.
Yeah, well, that's what's great about the segment, Tassie. When we look at it, and I was the same as Mike. I'm sure you're the same. I was Harding, or is it Green? Is it Harding? Is it Green? And I think I just settled on Green in the end. But either way, I mean, geez, Aussie boxing would have been the winner, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Unbelievable, mate. Great pick, Mike. And thank you to Danny Green and Jeff Harden for giving Australia, all your blood, sweat and tears and winning world titles for us and giving your heart and soul, for Australian boxing. So a big thank you to Danny Green and Jeff Harding.
Yeah, no, 100%, mate. Well said. Well, Tassie, we're back to you next week, mate. Have you had to think about who you would like to see lock horns in centre ring?
Yeah, I'm going back to, my favourite era of the 90s. And this would have been an all-action fight. Felix Tito Trinidad versus terrible Terry Norris at light middleweight. This fight sort of could have happened because they weren't that far away from each other, but it didn't happen. And I think this is a bar burner.
I love that fight, Mike. I must admit, I haven't really thought about Terry Norris in any of these dream fights, but that would have been an absolute ripper, Terry Norris and Felix Trinidad.
What a fight. It was actually, Don King was building towards that outing when Trinidad knocked out, was it Troy Waters? When Trinidad stopped Troy Waters in a round. That was the fight Don King was building towards, but Terry Norris opted to sign with Top Rank for Keith Mullings. Was supposed to be a tune-up for Oscar De La Hoya. And of course, Norris got stopped in that fight and the rest is history. But Terry Norris and Trinidad, man, what a fight. Both a little bit fragile.
Yep. Bit chinny, yep.
Norris,
Both get
in my
punched.
view, the more skilled. Norris, the more skilled. Trinidad, probably the better recuperative powers. What a fight.
Yeah, I love that fight, Tassie. I must admit, as I said, I hadn't given Terry Norris any thought in the dream fights, and that will be a
Terry
great
Norris,
fight.
Mildred Taylor, all that, the 90s, mate, unbelievable.
Yeah, well, I think we could pick out 100 fights from the 90s. There were so many great fighters, but that's a ripper. So that's next week. Felix Trinidad.
I was going to go Jason Menawar versus Julian Jackson, my dear friend Jason, but I couldn't do it to Jason.
Maybe next time. So Mike, we've got you for one more week next week, so we're looking forward to that. Peter will be back next week as well. So one last one before you head back into the business of the worldwide boxing circuit. But that should be a really good one to see you off. So thanks again, guys. Thanks to you also, Mike, for taking time out of your busy night. It looked like, as I said, you're at a train station there, but you've taken the time to tune in.
Pleasure.
So
I got another meeting to get to by 9:30. So,
well, it's 9
spoiler
o'clock now.
alert in terms of the time we're recording, but
Yeah.
no, pleasure always. It's great fun sitting and talking to you gentlemen, reliving some of the greatest moments in boxing history and reliving memories of some of the greatest fighters in boxing history.
Yeah, well said, mate. Well, thanks again, guys. I'll let you get to your meeting, Mike. I'll let you get back to what you're doing tonight, Tassie. I won't ask, and we'll see you next week.
See you, boys.
See you, boys.